This video is about the marriage of the Duke of Gordon and his lady love, who was Jane Maxwell. Not just the marriage, but what happened afterwards. Jane Maxwell was the flower of Galloway, a beautiful, beautiful young woman. She was the daughter of Sir William Maxwell, who had lands in Wigtonshire, but she was brought up in Edinburgh largely, at Hindford Close, where the Maxwell's townhouse was. The marriage took place in 1767 when he was 20, and she was about the same age, I think, and it took place in Berwick. When she was a teenager, she had made a name for herself in Edinburgh by some rather eccentric behaviour. She was high-spirited. For example, she rode down the high street on one occasion on a pig, the sort of thing that you would remember. Marshall wrote a tune for them called The Road to Berwick, more I think for the Duke than for Lady Jane, but it's called The Road to Berwick, and here it is. The Road to Berwick. Now, I want to tell you about Lady Jane Maxwell because there's plenty to tell. She was a member of the Women's Jockey Club. She founded the Gordon Highlanders. There are portraits of her by George Romney, Sir Joshua Reynolds and Sir Henry Raeburn. Robert Burns wrote a poem about her, specifically about her when she was dancing. She was a fine dancer. And she hosted famous soirees in Edinburgh for which Marshall made all the arrangements. The family moved down to London in 1787 and they stayed for some months there, well into 1788. They stayed in Downing Street, then Pall Mall, St James's Square. Marshall went with them and she became a favourite of the King, King George III. On one occasion, amazingly, he permitted her to wear Highland dress, which was strictly banned by law at that time, at a society ball. At her parties in London, everyone was made to dance Scottish dances. She also acted as a go-between between the king and his improvident son, who became the eventual George IV, of course, securing a reconciliation between the two. They never got on very well, and persuading the king to pay off his son's gambling debts, which were vast. Anyway, she could do all these things. There's something else she could do. Anxiety about the French Revolutionary Wars in 1794 led to a drive to enlarge the army. The Duchess had a bet with the Prince of Wales, with whom I think she was in pretty good terms, that she could raise more men than he could. She toured the Duke's lands in military uniform with a large black feather in her bonnet, and all the men who joined up received the king's shilling by kissing her. She held the coin between her teeth. Now, this is unusual, but it jolly well worked because she recruited 940 men that way, and that's how the Gordon Highlanders came into being. And I suspect she won her bet too. But her greatest achievement was the skill with which she married off her daughters to important men. She herself had married considerably above her, and she had an ambition that the same would happen with them. The first was Lady Charlotte, the oldest. She became Duchess of Richmond, and William Marshall wrote this reel for her, the Duchess of Richmond. Will forgive the little fluff notes in the middle. I'm sure she will. Anyway, we'll never know whether she does or not. Oh, I want to play the Duke's tune too. Marshall wrote a wonderful air for the Duke of Richmond, and certainly it deserves to be heard now. Here it is, the Duke of Richmond. the Duke of Richmond, his tune. Well, the next in line was Lady Madeline, about whom I know very little. She married someone called Sir Robert Sinclair, not such an important person. I hope they were happy together. Then there came Lady Susan, and she became Duchess of Manchester. She and her husband had 8 children. It was the done thing to have lots of children, particularly if you were an aristocrat. But I don't think their marriage was a happy one, despite all that. Maybe because of all that, who knows? Because the Duke was notoriously a philanderer. He was always away with someone somewhere. And of course she would become aware of this very quickly. So she took the example into her own hands, and she ran off with a footman eventually. Her conduct was described by the family as most notoriously bad. I hope they said something about the Duke too. Anyway, this is Marshall's tune for the Duchess of Manchester, and it's called The Duchess of Manchester's Farewell to the Highlands of Scotland. Duchess of Manchester's Farewell to the Highlands of Scotland. After Lady Susan came Lady Louisa, and the relationship between her and her eventual husband, the Marquis of Cornwallis, was dogged by one particular difficulty, but her mother solved the problem. The problem is very simply this. The Marquis's father was General Cornwallis, who was considered to be a national hero. He'd come back from the colonies, having lost the American War of Independence through incompetence. But somehow people thought he'd been a brave man and done his jolly well best. Think of all the trouble that led from that. Never mind. He discovered that the Marquis, his son, was thinking of marrying this woman from Scotland, from away far north, and he thought he knew, that in the Gordon family there was a strain of insanity, and that worried him, which was reasonable. So he investigated, and Lady Louisa's mother said, "You don't need to worry, she doesn't have a drop of Gordon blood in her, because the Duke is not her father, somebody else is." Now, she never divulged who it was, but it was probably a Captain Fraser of Beaulieu. She had been in love with him, and he'd gone abroad. This was before her marriage. And he'd gone abroad and had gone missing, was thought to be dead. She married the Duke, and then back came Captain Fraser. And almost certainly the liaisons began again, the relationship persisted. Now, don't blame her too harshly, because the Duke of Gordon himself had a habit of fathering children on servant girls round and about, and he started an affair is far too mild a word for it, with the daughter of his housekeeper, Jean Christie, that he eventually married her, aged 73. He was 73, she was younger, way on from here. They had 4 children together, and so his behaviour was very much open to question. However, forget all that. We move on to the tune, which is really the main thing. Marshall wrote for the Marchioness this splendid strathspey, and the Duke of Gordon was very fond of it. And when his evening concerts in Castle Gordon were coming to an end, he would ask for it to be played as the last tune that everyone heard. He liked it. It's a nice tune, so I think anyway. The most splendid marriage was the last one, when the last daughter, Georgiana, married the 6th Duke of Bedford, who was head of one of the most prestigious families in England, and their stately home was Woburn Abbey. She had been very close to his brother, the 5th Duke. They were never engaged, but he died. So she married the 6th Duke instead. Conveniently, his wife had died round about the same time. And together they had 9 children. There was a 10th, Lady Rachel, of whom I'll tell you something in a moment. The Duke, you would think, from way down there in Bedfordshire, travelling up to Scotland would be a bit of a bore, especially as it must have taken nearly a fortnight and been very uncomfortable. However, he liked to go up to the northern lands because he was a very keen fisherman and he loved fishing on the banks of the Spey. The Duchess had built for him a nice fishing lodge, and there on the wall was a splendid painting by Edwin Landseer, the famous painter who was responsible, was he not, for the lions in Trafalgar Square. Well, she had an affair with Landseer, and that's why the painting was there. The Duke, as I say, liked his fishing, and one day he was found in his hunting lodge there, sitting under an umbrella, supping his soup, quite happy. The roof leaked and he didn't want to get too wet. Oh yes, and I mentioned Landseer. Rachel, Lady Rachel, almost certainly was Landseer's child. We seem to be getting into this territory rather a lot, so I'll move on quickly to the tune. As quickly as I can, I haven't found the page yet. The Duchess of Bedford's Strathspey, which is again a fine tune. He wrote excellent tunes for all these women. Here we go. The Duchess of Bedford's Strathspey. All these relationships were to a certain degree complicated. So sadly was the relationship, or became the relationship, between the Duke and Duchess of Gordon. In the 1790s, they'd been married for 23 years when the year 1790 came along. In the 1790s, they grew apart. This was very much because of the Duke's behaviour. But the Duchess was not completely innocent in this. She had, it is thought, various relationships and liaisons a distance from the castle when she was away. And in any case, their marriage was over by 1790, 1791, or soon after. And in 1800, it was formally over because she left. The Duke built her a house called Kinrara, on the banks of the Spey in Badenoch. The house is beautiful. I've never been there, but I've seen it in pictures and it's lovely. And the location is even more lovely. It's a wonderful place. And there she went, and she spent some of her time there in the 12 years of her life that were remaining. She died in 1812. But she travelled about a lot, keeping up her contacts in Edinburgh and sometimes going down to London. Indeed, she died in London in Pulteney's Hotel in Piccadilly, and that was in 1812, as I said. The Duke, to give him his due, travelled down to have some last words with her 2 or 3 weeks before she died, and her daughters and her son, George Gordon, who was the Marquess of Huntly and who would succeed to the title of Duke of Gordon eventually, they were all present. She had asked that she be buried in the old Celtic chapel at the house Kinrara, and the Duke carried out this final wish, and he also did what she also asked. He had a memorial erected to her, and you can see the house and the memorial to this day. So it's rather a sad ending to a very interesting, unusual life, an interesting, unusual woman. This tune, Kinrara, was written in 1800 when she moved to the house, but it could be taken almost as an epitaph to her now that we know her whole story. Anyway, here is Kinrara by William Marshall to end this video.